Hello, everyone. I'm Leah Toms from the marketing team, and I'd love to welcome you to our webinar today, where we dive into the use cases of private and public certificate authorities. I have Jason Sirocco and Tim Callan here for you today. As always, we are recording this presentation and we'll share it with you afterwards. Finally, if you've got any questions during the presentation, send them our way. Please use the chat function and we'll answer as many questions as we can at the end. Jason and Tim, let's get started.
Thank you, Leah. How are you doing today, Jason?
Hey, doing great, Tim.
All right. So the topic of this webinar is to talk about when to use public and private CAs, and we'll explain the difference between the two, when to use them, and how to choose between them. Some of the advantages and risks of going with one or the other of these types of CA. Before we do that, though, let's you and I just take a minute and talk about why we're discussing this now. The reason we're discussing this now in particular is a few things, kind of a constellation of a few things coming together, but the biggest of which is that the CA browser forum recently passed its ballot SC081 from the Service Certificate Working Group. And what that does is that will step down over time the maximum term for a public service certificate all the way down to 47 days. And in less than a year from now, it'll go down to 200 days, half a year. It'll continue to going down from there. That is not the subject matter of this webinar, but it is very important as part of the environment that we're in right now. Because one of the big objections that came up to that is, well, we have systems where it's difficult to change those systems that quickly. We have IoT and et cetera, et cetera. And in many of these cases, the response to that is, why are you using public CA at all here? This doesn't feel like a public CA use case. And, when people say they can't afford the kind of agility that comes with those short certificate lifespans, we say, that sounds like, that sounds like that sounds like a private CA use case. The second thing I think that also is here, just as a piece of background, is the last year has seen incredible tightening up on the rules around mandatory revocations in the public service certificate space. We saw a year ago at this time, there were a lot of CAs that were just ignoring the rules and giving subscribers as much time as they wanted to swap out their certs. And sometimes that could have been as long as 60, 90 days to swap out their certs. And it became very clear from the browsers that that is really not acceptable. And so I think we're in a new era where it's going to be a very bad idea for CAs to be lax in the way that some of them have been lax in the past. And so once again, that comes back to people saying, look, I'm not signed up for this. I'm not ready. I can't have a situation where I may have to revoke my certs in 5 days or 24 hours. And then the response to that is, hey, that is probably a private CA use case. And so, that with our background, why don't we get into it, Jason? Sounds good?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So, short story, public CAs equals external, private CAs equals internal. You want to expand on that a little?
Yeah, Tim, I think this is, if you need it in extremely simple terms and equate it to one concept, I think that anytime you're talking about dealing with external trust, people that you've never dealt with before, the use case of public certificate authorities and publicly trusted certificates is a good one. Basically, to me, in my mind, the public certificate authorities and publicly trusted certificates are all about the web server and browser use case. In other words, the protection of the identity of a domain, of a website, and the ability to have an encrypted session between the web server and a browser. What makes a public CA is that the public key of the CA exists in the root store of a browser. That to me is the
Right.
definition. And so
Yeah.
therefore it's really all about web browsers. There are of course edge cases of technologies around web browsers, but essentially it's about web browsers. Private CAs are about everything else.
Right. So we got to kind of this laid out here. I think this is a lot of what you just said, right? Public CAs, when it says trusted globally, that's another way of saying what you said, that the root is included in the popular browsers and operating systems that ship by default, as opposed to the private CA where you have to put that root in. And then you talked about the difference, right? External facing services, website, email, etc., as opposed to internal networks, applications, etc. This bottom one is good, though, to talk about, right? And this is what we were alluding to in the beginning. Public CAs, fundamentally, there are a set of rules that are defined by the root store programs and by the CA Browser Forum. And a public CA just has to abide by those, right? We are a large public CA, and we have to abide by the CAB forum rules and the browser root program rules, even if they're not the way we would have made the rules, if it were up to us, right? Because it isn't up to us, and we must follow those regardless of what they are. As opposed to when you are your own CA, then you get to make your own rules. You own it. You make the decisions. Now, there are things that maybe are bad choices and you really shouldn't do. But at the end of the day, there isn't a regulation preventing you from doing that, if that makes sense. Right?
Yeah, Tim, I would say maybe the most important point to be made here is for those of you who are going to be affected by the changes Tim referred to earlier. For those of you who are using public trusted certificates for the purposes of client authentication, for example, swapping those certificates on a laptop or a mobile device every 47 days is not really tenable. And so, therefore, the use
Yeah.
of a private CA to have longer certificate lifespans for those types of use cases is way better. And so, therefore, let's use browser certificates where browsers are used, and
Yeah.
use private CA certificates for everything else.
Right. So yeah, did we hit these? Why don't you run down these use cases? I think we hit some of them, right? We
Sure,
talked a
Tim.
lot about the first one.
Yeah, this is your world, Tim. The public CA
Yeah,
use cases where basically the very top one is exactly, and I love that you use the terminology that the proper terminology of TLS server certificates that are used with securing websites. In other words, the ability to protect the or ensure the ownership of a domain and ensure that the eh, communication between a web server and a web browser is encrypted. That is that top bullet point. But there are so many other cases in which a public CA issues certificates, and that includes public SMIME, public code
yeah,
signing, public document signing, and sometimes uh, publicly trusted certificates are used for device and IoT
yeah,
authentication, but it is, I would say, that's going to become less in the
yeah.
future.
Probably mostly you don't want that. There are scenarios where I think you have to have that, but that's one of the areas. That's why I included this as the last bullet because people do this. I'm not entirely sure they should be all the time or often. Yeah, but all of these use cases are things where another way to think about it is all of these use cases are things where you need to be able to communicate with others that you don't control, that are not inside of your organization and you don't even necessarily entirely know who they are, right? A website or a server that's facing the world is a good example of that. Email is a great example of that. I have to send email to whoever I have to send it to. Code signing, I sign the code and then it's going to go and sit on Windows devices and it just has to work. And those aren't necessarily Windows devices that I control. Doc signing, same thing. I sign a document. Other parties need to be able to access that document, and I don't control their environments, right? And that's where the IoT and device situation comes in, which is maybe not. It kind of depends on the circumstances, right? Now the private use cases, Jay, go.
That is literally everything else. And I can say that on that first chart where you saw signing and you saw encryption of data in transit, private CA is almost entirely about authentication. And
Right.
so, therefore, if you have internal systems and applications that are authenticating to each other, are typically authenticating through APIs, users that are using client certificates, and this is that second bullet point is probably the main reason we are having this conversation because quite a lot of you use publicly trusted certificates for the case of user authentication and using client certificates for authentication. And a lot of times, what's happening is those certificates are not very agile. In other words, they're very difficult to swap on demand. If a salesperson is in an airplane 30,000 feet
Yeah.
and you need to swap that certificate, that's difficult to do and that's going to cause you pain. So, therefore, having that in a private sense allows you to have a certificate of policy that allows for that kind of scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I look at this bottom bullet, custom policy for enforcement and compliance. This is what we talked about before, and this is one of the big things that, again, you hear as objections. People will say, well, we don't want this. You're forcing our certificates to be this way, and we don't want this. We don't like the maximum term. We don't like the revocation deadline. Those are the two that come up the most. But it might be other things. We don't like the content in the cert. We want to be able to include an organization unit field. We want to be able to have different information. And under those circumstances, my response is, you okay? Well, if you have a private CA, you can do that, right? And you really need to ask yourself, if I do, I have to have a public CA, and if you don't have to, then you really probably want to be moving to private certs.
Tim, yeah, Tim, before we go on to the next set of
Mm-hmm.
slides, I think it's worth making a point at this point in the deck that
Mm-hmm.
one of the main reasons why publicly trusted certificates were often used for authentication purposes is simply because it was easy to
Yeah,
get a publicly trusted certificate. And
yeah.
that is what is changing is that it was too easy. And I would say that people's habit of using publicly trusted certificates where it is inappropriate is going to have to change. And
No, you're
therefore,
exactly right. I think we know this factually. There are a lot of circumstances where people said, "Gee, setting up my own PKI and running my own CA, this is hard. This is daunting. This is something that I'm afraid I'm not going to get right." Right? I know enough to know that the stakes are high and I don't want to mess it up, and I also know enough to know that that it's conceivable that I don't get it right. I'll tell you what, I'll just use public certs because that's fine for everybody, right? It'll be fine. It's securing the world's largest financial institutions. It can secure me, and you can see that instinct. You can see where someone would come to that conclusion. The trouble is then we turn around and those same people say, "Well, I'm having trouble. I'm chafing. I'm having trouble living with the requirements." And that's where you really just need to get yourself to a private CA, I think. So, uh, Jason, part of this that enters into this is the decline of legacy technology stacks. So, go.
yeah, go ahead to the next slide there, Tim.
Yeah.
And when you are thinking about a private CA, in other words, for those of you especially who are under the regime of having to make the acceptance of, okay, I'm going to change, I'm going to move my client authentication to a private CA. I think that there's a very important consideration in this decline of legacy technology stacks because some of you might be tempted because it's what you've known for 20, 30 years plus to choose something like a Microsoft CA. It's sitting there in Windows, but many of you might not realize it's essentially deprecated. It's so widely for those of you who are looking at legacy private CAs, I think that what you need to understand is that there are new private certificate authority technologies that are out there that eh, cover a lot of these new bullet points in such a much, much better way. And in fact, that second bullet point might be the most important, which is we all now live in heterogeneous technology stacks. In other words, the places that you're putting those client authentication certificates includes laptops, server environments that include non-Windows environments like Windows, mobile devices that include technologies such as Android, iOS that are not domain attached. In other words, probably the most important thing to note is non-domain attached operating systems, non-Windows operating systems, heterogeneous technology stacks, including systems that are out in the cloud, API systems that have nothing to do with any of these applications or legacy operating systems. Those are all the places that you're going to be putting these client authentication certificates. And therefore, you need a private CA that can handle all of that. And thankfully, private CA systems have moved on compared to what a lot of you have experienced over the past 10, 15, and 20 years. I would say that other bullet points that are important to note is certificate lifecycle management. Believe it or not, you can now have visibility to all of your
Yeah.
certificates and have advanced provisioning technologies, the ability to automate revocation, things that you never had in legacy private CAs, Tim.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So that would be, that would be another, that would go back to the point about saying, I'm using the public CA just because I'm getting this kind of ready-made system that I can just take off the shelf and plug in. And you absolutely can do that now in a private CA scenario. You can get a managed service. You don't have to sit and develop your own. You can get a managed service. You can get an advisor who helps you configure things and figure out exactly what you want and make these decisions for your CA. And then from there, you can just plain take it off the shelf and plug it in, which is a lot of what people are looking for when they are using public certs in a scenario where private probably makes more sense.
Thanks, Tim. I think
Yeah.
a lot of the rest of this deck has to do with that second to last bullet point, which is trust
Mhm.
model flexibility. So let's move on.
All right, let's see what we got. All right, and hazards of choosing the wrong CA. Some of this is the reverse of what we just said, but not all of it, right?
Tim, I think that one of the most important bullet points, we talked about visibility, we talked about the limited use cases because of the legacy technology stacks,
Mhm.
but I think that for people who were looking at private CAs in the public clouds, like the big hyperscalers, they're looking to lock you in, and so be
Yeah,
careful of that.
yeah,
Um, and I would, not to dwell on it too much, but I think that all of these things that really lead to that top bullet point of lack of visibility. There are so many private CAs that are out there that are meant for very, very singular things that you might be tempted to look at them when in reality you need something that is generalized for being a modern private CA and modern to the point of that final bullet point of one of the things you should be asking a private CA vendor is, what is your post-quantum cryptography roadmap?
sure.
And there are a lot of private CAs that are legacy that don't have that. And Tim, I think that might be one of the most important points at this point in our
Yeah,
history.
absolutely, right. This is as time goes on, that becomes increasingly important. We're at the point now where we're advising everyone we talk to that you need to be building your PQC strategy. You need to know what your cryptography is. You need to know what's going to be involved in upgrading it. You need to have a strategy to do it. This is the time to do things like bring on vendors or pressure vendors to change, to allocate budget, to create project teams and manage those projects. All of that should be happening now. And so if you're getting involved in a CA that isn't going to be able to make that migration, you're going to be throwing that CA away like almost immediately.
Yeah, which is one of the last things you want to do with a private CA. Typically, these things last a
Yeah.
long time.
Yep, exactly. And so talk to us about hybrid models.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. The
Okay.
hybrid certificate authority models in private CAs is very important concept. So we're talking, Tim, about a fundamentally important concept in PKI, which is trust models. And that
Hmm.
essentially defines how you trust and how you're going to bestow trust. And so for a lot of you who might already have a legacy private CA in your systems, you might want to hold that root very near and dear to your heart. And for those of you, I totally understand it. One of the things you should ask your private CA vendors is whether or not they have the flexibility to allow you to hold your own route and then sign other types of subordinate CAs, such as issuing CAs, that can then allow you to have that future proofed capability and the ability to work with different technology stacks and issue certificates into different environments. Really, it's all about how you want to bestow trust. Do you have a partner environment that you want to be able to include in the trust wall? Do you have employees? See, this is the thing about private CAs, Tim. It's not like public where, they're basically trusted by every browser and they're great for that. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to actually wall off where trust begins and ends. The real beauty of private certificate authorities is when you
Yeah.
issue a key pair to a particular identity, you're issuing that trust to a very specific type of entity that can then trust everybody else within the trust boundary. And how you do that, how you can actually then create an architecture that's incredibly secure, which is something that as a public CA, Sectigo happens to know a lot about, that ability to have flexibility of who holds the root CA, where's the HSM behind the root, various kinds of subordinates, and then ultimately issuing CAs, which get the certificates out to the places they need to go. All those things can be separate entities and can chain up to the trust that you define. And to me, when we're going to have a mix potentially, Tim, of legacy RSA or ECC based cryptographic algorithms for certificate authorities that exist within your walls right now, the ability to then have PQC based certificate authorities that are doing the issuance, this concept might be critical in the way we move forward in PQC. So remember that term of hybrid certificate authorities. You can mix and match, and that's an important and powerful aspect of private CAs.
Yeah. Now, the other side of that, of course, is with that flexibility and that freedom means you also have the flexibility to shoot yourself in the foot. So being cognizant of that, I think, and making wise decisions. And again, this is again sometimes where a managed service is extremely helpful. It limits that, right? Or it mitigates that risk, I would say.
Don't roll your own crypto and do this with a private CA vendor that really knows what they're doing. That is very clear advice.
All right, so I mentioned this in the beginning, but there are changes coming to public CAs that are really going to make a difference. I talked about the step down to 47 days. Just very quickly, this is what it looks like. And the key column here is the one on the left for today. Today, the maximum term for a public TLS service is 398 days. That will be going down to 200 days on March 15th of 2026. 200 days means you can basically renew your certs every 6 months. It'll go down to 100 days a year later. That means you can basically renew your certs every 3 months. It'll go down to 47 days 2 years after that, which will basically mean that you're going to renew your certs every month. So we're going to take over the next 4 years, a little under 4 years, we're going to get down to the point where our certs are being renewed every month. That's one of the big drivers on this. And, that's got a whole bunch of people rolling down the process right now of trying to figure out what they're going to do about this and how it's going to work. And that is bringing up this question, a part of this question. When we look at step one, awareness and discovery, step two, vendor technology inventory, is to say, do I have public certs today that should be on a private CA, either one I already have or one I need to get? And under those circumstances, what's my plan for migrating them over? So part of staying ahead of this step down process is literally moving the certs off of public TLS that don't want to be on public TLS in the first place, identifying those as part of your, steps 1 through 3 really here, identifying what they are, and saying, okay, these certs should be on a private CA, and I'm going to migrate them to that, at which point they can be on whatever renewal cadence you determine as wise. And certainly they're not going to be limited to 200 days, 100 days, 47 days. If you're using a 1-year cert or a 2-year cert, that's perfectly viable. And so that becomes, I think, one of the key points in dealing with the path to 47-day certificates. So let's just remember that as we are doing our plans for stepping down to 40-day certificates, 47-day certificates, moving off of public CA where I don't want to be there anymore is an important tool in your toolbox to get that done. Right, Jay?
No, Tim, that is just so important. I think that certificate agility and all of these things that are pushing you towards the shorter certificate lifespans, all of these things should be embraced as part of an overall automation system within IT, and making sure that this eventuality doesn't end up causing you the headache of outages. Tim, I would say that preparation even for crypto agility at the very final step,
Yeah.
the ability to embrace that automation for that eventuality where we're going to be living in a world where swapping out certificates due to deprecations of cryptographic algorithms, that's the world we're going to be living in. It's the world that I know a lot of people aren't prepared for, but you're
Right.
going to have to. And I think that when Google and Apple and others have been discussing this, the motivation to get certificate agility into everybody's minds and eventually into everybody's hands, it's just such an important concept.
Yeah, and maybe let me make a couple other points clear. One of them is there are a lot of benefits to shorter certificates, and you and I have talked about this a lot. I think we did webinars on this in the past. Um, those benefits do apply in a private CA situation as well. So you do want to be thinking about that and be cognizant of that. And you probably, even in a private CA situation, you probably don't want to be out there issuing 5 and 10-year certs, right? Even though you can, doesn't mean that you should. And so that's point number one to consider. Maybe we're a little more relaxed in that scenario, but we don't want to just go all the way to no regulation and no control, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, Tim. Just a quick point. Private certificate authorities that are currently existing under things such as Kubernetes clusters that are managing uh, basically containers, some of those certificate authorities are set to 2 hours, sometimes
sure.
minutes. And so therefore, a lot of private certificate authority experts are actually embracing extremely short certificate lifespans, in fact,
Yeah.
sometimes ephemeral.
And that goes right to the second point I was going to make is automation is not only a virtue for public certs. It's absolutely a virtue for public certs because, you have forced expiration and therefore you can have, failures and outages, and that risk is going to go up as certificate lifespans get shorter. And so the benefit and the need for automation is going to continue to increase. But again, same thing applies on your private CA side. If I've taken my internal systems and processes and I'm issuing private certs and those certs expire and they don't get renewed, and my systems go down, my system still went down. It's still the same basic problem. And
Yeah.
automation is also a maybe silver bullet is too strong a word, but not by much, is an
Tim,
extraordinarily important part of solving those risks as well.
yeah, ironically, I would have to say if you add up the totality of all private CAs in the world today, there's probably more automation in the private world than there is in public. And that
Right.
that is the ironic thing.
Right. So the point being that don't think when you're moving your certs off the public CA scenario and moving them to your private CA because they don't need to be public. We do think that that is a very smart thing for a lot of people to consider. And I think we're expecting, and I would say hoping, to see that kind of migration coming in the next few years, where a lot of public certs that shouldn't be public certs aren't. At the same time, when you do that, that doesn't relieve you from considering matters of maximum certificate term and automation and things along these lines. We talked about the revocation. I think this point I covered at the beginning, but mandatory revocation is just going to be much stricter and much strongly enforced, and I just don't think we're going to see the kind of lax attitude that we were seeing from a whole lot of CAs a year ago at this time. I think those days are behind us, and if there's a misissuance event, I think you should expect your certs to be revoked between 24 and 120 hours, depending on the nature of the error.
Tim, I think that we've entered the era where every certificate needs to be a managed certificate. And by
Yes,
managed, we mean fully automated, fully visible, not just on a spreadsheet where, perhaps potentially rogue certificates exist and therefore you don't have to worry about discovery. Those days of non-scaled publicly trusted certificates are long over, and
I agree.
that therefore every certificate needs to be a managed certificate, Tim.
Yeah, I completely concur. All right. Well, actually, that's our prepared material. So let me take a minute to shamelessly plug the podcast. Jason and I do record the Root Causes PKI and Security podcast. We come up with our own topics. We come up with our own content. We record it. We distribute it. And we're posting multiple episodes per week. We are getting near our 500th episode, and we would love for you to come join us. We cover this topic and others related, all the things we talked about today, and other things in the world of PKI, encryption, related technology, PQC, blockchain, things like that. We would love to have you come join us while we talk about these topics. And with that, I think we're ready for questions.
Great. And we had a couple. The first one is, what is more important, public or private trust?
Yeah, I think they're a yin and a yang, and I can't see you really going without either if you're any kind of sophisticated enterprise. Obviously, if we don't have public trust, we can't face the world, right? We can't have e-commerce sites. We can't have partner portals. There's all kinds of stuff we just can't have. At the same time, if you just wanted to use public certs on everything, that would be deeply problematic for a lot of the reasons we covered here. So, I get why someone asked that question. I'm not sure that's how I would ask the question. I think the way I would ask the question is more about what we tried to talk about here. It's the right tool for the right circumstance.
Yeah, Tim, if you are, as an enterprise, are serving a website, you need publicly trusted certificates because you're going to be dealing with people with browsers who need that public trust. If you are have a responsibility over a sales team, and that sales team all needs to securely log into salesforce.com or some CRM, you may want a private CA to be able to issue certificates to those people in order to perform client authentication. That's public and that's private. Those are the differences. It has to do with the use case.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, great. Then a question came in for MTLS certificates using private CAs. Would we need to distribute routes to B2B partners? Is this where the industry is going? And then a little comment, love your podcast, by the way.
Yeah, see, that's where I think there's a tough one. As soon as your partner who you don't control is using your route, like that's theoretically possible, but that's a heavy lift, right? And to some degree, it depends on the nature of the partnership. Sometimes what you see is you see people enter into consortia where basically everyone inside of the consortium is going to embed the same roots. And then you can have sort of a quasi-public right route where it isn't really a public route, but it's only used by a limited number of parties who have all kind of eyes open signed up for this particular set of certificates and routes that they're going to use. But no, I mean the challenge with that is that they're not going to have those routes, and distributing those routes to them is going to be phenomenally difficult. And as soon as you're getting into any kind of partner portal ecosystem kind of situation, I think almost always you're looking at a public CA scenario. Right, Jay?
Tim, I think in light of what happened this year with respect to the decoupling of public and private, it's become clearer than ever that any consortia that ever chose public certificates, like truly public certificates, has made an error. I hate to say it, but that's just true. Private CAs, the reason why people went public was because private CAs are quite often difficult to set up, and therefore people quite often will choose public. And it is a mistake because the certificate agility within those kinds of environments simply cannot be achieved in the way that the root store operators want them to be. And that's just simply it. If you cannot swap your certs rapidly, then you have to go private. It's as simple as that. And that's
And
true for
and
all
and now,
consortia.
on the other hand, if I'm setting up what once upon a time they called an extranet, right? If I'm going to have just good old fashioned servers sitting in racks, and what's going to happen is my API is going to be accessed by partners to whom I have given granted access, and I've given them adequate login credentials so that they can tie into my systems and do things. That's a public CA scenario, because going and attempting to get those partners to embed my roots on the necessary systems and make sure they're still embedded there when they pull out a new box and plug in, pop in the next one. That is just fraught with risk.
Yeah, but
I
a
think
lot of
that is a public CA scenario.
sure, sure. But remember, when we're talking about consortia, we're quite often talking about, we have to think about the use case. If the use case is authentication, then there are probably no good use cases right now for public with respect to authentication. It really should be private. Authentication use cases are the ones where certificate agility is very, very difficult to achieve. The ability to have consortia trust with private CAs, asking people to the worst consortia we've ever seen, the worst scenarios are the ones where one dominant company within consortia is saying use my private CA, and that's where private CAs get a bad name, and that's part of where a lot of trouble comes from. But in reality, good consortia go to a trusted third party, something like a Sectigo, in fact, to set up a private CA where the hierarchy is flat amongst all the consortia members. That's how you set it up. That's the way good consortia have always set their stuff up, and that's the way it should be done in the future.
Right. So that's a consortium scenario. In the scenario that I'm just a company and I'm putting together a partner program, and my guys need logins and I'm going to have services and stuff available to them, that's not a consortium. That is a public cert use case. So that's the difference, I think. All
Okay,
right,
great.
next.
And next question is there a use case for private CAs expanding to third-party trusted vendors? For example, can we pass them copies of the root or intermediate certificate and expand our internal coverage? The person asking would like to know about the risks and downsides of something like this.
Jason, you want to field that one?
Yeah, sorry, I think that question is worth me asking one more time, Lee.
So ultimately, the question is there a use case for private CAs expanding to third-party trusted vendors?
when you want to extend trust to third parties, and this is exactly what Tim is talking about. If you have an existing private CA that you are issuing certificates from, and you have a third party that you want to be able to enable to do this, there is probably the very best scenario, I would say, is you might be tempted to use publicly trusted certificates. But on the other hand, if that third party has their own private CA issuance and is able to then potentially cross sign across your own private CA, something that a Sectigo can help you to do, then all of a sudden you have trust extended across all these third parties. People who are able to then get their certificates where they need to go, and you're not dealing with this 47-day issue that the root stores are forcing non-browser based authentication use cases to be under. So therefore, PKI has evolved over the years to be able to handle these kinds of trust scenarios. And what it takes is, don't do it yourself. You really should be doing those kinds of complex examples with a trusted security partner who knows how to set up private CAs. And yes, you can extend trust like that. And in fact, it's been done many, many times. In fact, the U.S. Trust, right, the federal bridge from the U.S. government, that's entirely how it works. And there's all kinds of ways that it can work on smaller scales, even for medium-sized organizations.
Thank you, Jason. And next question is around automation. How safe is it to let a third party automate certificates for you and for your domains?
Uh, I
It's been
would
done for
offer,
years.
yeah, I would offer that third party, depending on the third party. But if you're talking about, somebody who, passes the obvious measures of someone that you'd rely on, that third party is probably better at it than you are, right? Like if there's someone who's doing this professionally, uh, their likelihood that they're making an error and causing you to have outages or compliance failures because the deployment of renewed certificates isn't done correctly is probably less than if you try to grow your own, right? So this is an area where just like we allow all kinds of specialists to do individual pieces of technology for us. We're not sitting and writing our own operating systems. We're not sitting with a soldering iron putting together our own motherboards, right? We're letting other people do that who are good at that, and that's what they do. And I think the same thing applies here. Get a good vendor and a credible vendor, and I think you're probably considerably safer than trying to do it yourself.
Thank you, Tim. Then a question in relation to 47 days. Will there be a certificate renewal automation feature in Sectigo, and is there a cost?
Um, yes, there is now, and you certainly that is applicable and usable in that kind of time frame. And that renewal of certificates is part of the fundamentals of what the package offers. I would say if you want to be using that and you're not, talk to your representative and we can get you started on that.
Great. Um, why should I work with a public certificate authority for my private CA?
I love that question. Um, when you set up PKI routes that are as important and as long-lived as a public certificate authority, you get really, really good at doing it right. And I'm really proud to say that at Sectigo, we set up our private certificate authorities with the same kind of rigor. And dealing with a company that really truly understands how to set up the root structure and that that trust model that we talked about earlier, that is a heritage that only a small number of companies have, and those small companies, smaller number of companies are typically public CA vendors. I would say that the most important thing to note about private CAs from a public CA vendor is that number one, the public CAs all know that a ultimate root of the trust hierarchy should absolutely have its private keys stored in an HSM. There are so many private CAs out in the world that the private keys are generated in software and have no security whatsoever. And I often ask the question, why did you even bother to set up that private CA? And one of the things that is offered in a modern private CA for those of you who don't want to pay the $50,000 for a hardware HSM is multi-tenant HSMs where your private keys are generated in an extraordinarily safe place. So therefore, I would say that Tim likes to talk about, I like to talk about the difference between security and infrastructure within PKI, and this is probably one of the biggest security stories within our industry where a public CA will set up your private CA more secure than anybody else.
Thank you. And then a question, which integrations do you offer, and particularly can we integrate with ServiceNow?
Many and yes.
Many and yes.
So there are more than 50 integrations. ServiceNow is among them. Yeah, there's a ServiceNow. Now I'm not going to use the right word, but there's a plugin basically you can get. So you're living inside of your ServiceNow environment. You're driving the CLM in the back.
Yeah. There's many integration types. That's a really good example of IT automation workflow. There's also integrations into other CAs in order to get visibility. There are integrations to things such as Slack for messaging. So there's many categories of integrations as well.
Why should I move away from Microsoft Active Directory?
Ooh, go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, well, there's a really good example of where you can listen to the Root Causes podcast. Tim and I have pondered this question over and over and over. And I would say that number one, if you saw that future proof bullet point on one of the slides earlier, I'm not thoroughly convinced that Microsoft CA, Microsoft Certificate Services, Microsoft Active Directory Certificate Services very specifically,
Yeah.
has a roadmap into the PQC world.
Yep. Yep. That's a big one. And in general, it has been a technology offering where we haven't seen innovation, right? So that's part of the reason that we worry. There's been no word from Microsoft around there being a PQC roadmap. In general, it doesn't seem to be something that's getting a lot of care and attention. And when you put those two things together, it's a little scary. The other thing about MSCA is technology stacks are just very different from what they were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you might really be a Windows shop. You were using Windows Server, you were using Windows clients, you were kind of all Windows. And that was a tool that was designed to facilitate and encourage the all Windows environment. Well, that race has been run, and the all Windows scenario did not win, right? And so we have very heterogeneous environments. We have a ton of Linux on our servers. We have a variety of operating systems, certainly including a bunch of Windows, but not exclusively Windows on our laptops. We have almost no Windows on our mobile devices. Who has a Windows mobile device? And so when you put all of this together, having a Windows only solution, what is it a solution for?
Tim, you could even have a Windows laptop and not be domain attached. Therefore,
Yeah,
MSCA makes no sense.
yeah. So it's just so limited in its value in a modern context. And so, in general, we feel like the MSCA that we see, or the Active Directory Certificate Services, sorry, I still just say MSCA, it rolls off my tongue, is mostly legacy. It's stuff that was put in place at a different time when that did seem like a more viable option, and it's hard to remove it. And we see a lot of people wrapping a managed PKI around their MSCA, so they don't have to rip it out, but they can serve the other operating systems and environments and get the benefits of a modern CLM approach and things along those lines. So I think a great deal of the MSCA you see today is there because the decision was made at a different time.
Cool. A bit of a longer one. I'm currently creating certificates for a dozen third-party vendors, and I'm trying to automate. The third-party vendors should control the certificates completely. How can I convince management that this is safe?
Just read the front part one more time so we make sure we're getting it right.
Yeah, I'm currently creating certificates for a dozen third-party vendors and trying to automate this. The third-party vendors should control the certificates completely. How do I convince management that this is a safe thing to do?
I think we would need to learn more about the actual use case that's happening. If I'd have to understand what the certificates are actually doing. I mean, with that exact wording, we could be talking about an MSP that is managing publicly trusted certificates on behalf of several important clients. We could also be talking about an organization that is dealing with a partner program, just like Tim talked
Yeah,
about earlier, for purposes of API authentication, right? So in other words, I
yeah,
would have to understand better what the use case actually was.
yeah. I mean, when I hear that word vendor, I feel like it's more like the second one than the first one, just by use of that choice of words. Um, so then I guess, is that what you want to do? I'm not sure that's what you want to do.
I think this is a great question where we can maybe follow up one-on-one.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We should do that. Let's follow up offline because we know who asked it. And we'll get more clarity on what's being asked.
Perfect. And that was actually also the last question, a couple of minutes earlier.
Okay.
Um, I think let's wrap it up here. Obviously, if you've got any other questions, do get in touch with us. Thank you everyone for your time today. Thanks, Jason and Tim. We have other webinars coming up. We always post them on our website, so check that out. We'd love to see you. But for now, thank you and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.